Stai ascoltando il podcast di discorsi fotografici.
Dal 2010 il primo podcast italiano di fotografia.
Novità, interviste, recensioni, cultura fotografica.
Discorsifotografici.it.
The Shunyo Raja Monographies is an ongoing 9-year long-term photography trilogy that proposes 3 conceptually distinct ways of visualizing the Bengala Delta, considered one of the ground zeros of climate change. The rising sea levels and surging rivers have submerged many islands in the region and put millions of people at risk of becoming climate refugees. This work visually maps the trajectory of those displaced, homes destroyed, schools collapsed, and landscapes lost due to erosion, sea level rise, and cyclonic activity. In the exhibition, 2 of the 3 projects chapter, Kings of a Bereft Land, a photography project comprising portraits and landscapes mapping erosion and sea level rise in the Bengala Delta across India and Bangladesh. Where do we go when the final wave hits? A photographic framework that creates an equivalence between the battle against climate change and the global war on terror, which both deal with invisible, yet omnipresent, omnipotent enemies that can strike anytime, anyhow, anywhere. Water is the element of terror here. Could you share what inspired you to create the Shunyo Raja Monographies photo trilogy? And what is your primary objective in documenting the Bengala Delta as the epicenter of climate change?
I live in the Bengala Delta myself. I'm from Calcutta, which is slightly outside of the Bengala Delta, but if the delta is very strongly affected and we lose the land due to sea level rise, finally Calcutta will also get affected. So which means my friends, my family, all of that we would also be forced to move and become climate refugees at some point. And I think that was one of the main motivations of starting the project. And then from that I sort of gradually enlarged the project to the trilogy right now. The trilogy is essentially a way to look at the same site of climate change, the Bengala Delta, but through different visual strategies. So it proposes 3 different readings of climate change in different ways, different artistic, different visual, as well as different conceptually distinct ways. So that's the trilogy. And I work on trilogies for my projects. For a lot of the other projects, it kind of comes from a lot of the filmmakers that I like, and they usually like Lars von Trier, who always divides his work into a lot of trilogies. And I use that form in a lot of my other projects as well. So that's where the trilogy comes from. As far as what I want to do with the project, I think the Bengala Delta really is one of the ground zeros of climate change. There are others, but this is the one that I want to focus on, primarily because there are millions of people in the Bengala Delta. It's a very densely populated area, and if that land is severely affected in the coming decades, in the coming years, you would have millions of people who would have to become climate refugees. The problem is that there are no places where they can go to because the region already is very densely populated, right? So I think it's very important to speak about that, but also more importantly, not to speak just about the Bengala Delta, but about climate change, which is a planetary crisis, and kind of talk about that and keep talking about that.
How did you approach the challenge of conceptually visualizing human impact on climate change through your photography? What techniques do you use to visually convey the journey of the displaced and the transformation of the lost landscapes in the Bengala Delta region?
I think the main thing for me was to look at climate change from a space which is not a breaking news photography. I think a lot of the main problem with climate change is I think that a lot of it gets seen through the filter of, there is a cyclone that has come and then people's homes are destroyed, or there's a massive flood or a forest fire. And at that point, like, a lot of photographers are going and focusing on that, and then there's nothing anymore till another crisis or a catastrophe happens. What I realize is that in the Bengal Delta, people are living on a day-to-day basis with, or they have to reconcile with the idea of climate change, with the rising sea level in a 24/7 basis, right? So, and that kind of defines your life in a very different way when you have to think about that every day, about how you can live around the tides and how you can live around this constant presence of the water that's increasing. So my work kind of focuses away from the breaking news photography and looks at the day-to-day life revolving around this constant presence of climate change. And I try to do that in these, like, the first chapter is more landscapes and portraits, and it's more formalist in structure, I would say. And that's what we're showing here. And we're also showing the second chapter where I move into the night, which becomes a more sort of crazy, ominous, dark landscape. The first chapter is slightly more poetic, if we could put that term. I mean, there's poetry in destruction, but that poetry is still there. The second and the third chapters kind of break away from that and create a more dystopic space where people are really fighting around that water at night, and I think the night is very important here because a lot of these spaces do not have electricity, so you're kind of forced to face an enemy that you cannot see, and that can, because it's fluid, it can come from any direction, right? So it's really kind of there is an element of terror in it, which is like a war zone, where you can be attacked from whatever direction at whatever point of time. So I was kind of trying to approximate and build that sort of visual equivalence between a war zone, and because we talk about like the war against terrorism or the war against climate change. Recently we had the war against the pandemic. So we are always using these terms of war, battle. So I wanted to bring that idea, bring it out more.
Could you explain the meaning of the titles Kings of a Bereft Land and Where Do We Go When the Final Wave Hits, featured in your exhibition? How do these chapters relate to your visual narrative of climate change in the Bengal Delta?
So the title Kings of a Bereft Land is really a translation of Shunyo Raja Monographies. Shunyo Raja is a term in my language in Bangla, and Shunyo means empty or zero, and Raja is the king, right? So Kings of a Bereft Land is really a poetic translation of Shunyo Raja, and that is the name of the first project. Because basically what happened is, one of these people that I met on my journeys and my travels, he told me that we are Shunyo Rajas, which means that what he wanted to say was that this is essentially a land of plenty. It's very fertile, so when you have the land, there is a lot of, it's very fertile, you can live off it very well. But once it's gone, you go from 100 to 0 very quickly. Your impoverishment is very total, right? So that's where the Shunyo Raja comes from. And where do we go when the final wave hits is essentially kind of trying to look at that sort of dystopic space in which these are people who are constantly, fighting the water, and at some point this entire region might very well go under, and at that point they would have to go. So the big question is, where would they go? So that's where the name of the project comes from.
Could you share a significant moment from your fieldwork in the Bengal Delta and how this experience influenced your artistic approach and understanding of climate change in the region?
I think there are quite a few images already in the exhibition that could be considered significant moments, but I can speak about one. Is this image where you have an entire family standing in front of their furniture, they are, I think that image was very important because what happened was, at night when they went to sleep, they suddenly woke up at some point and realized that the ground beneath their home is disappearing. It's falling into the river due to the river erosion, and they basically tried to save whatever they could. and that's what you see in the image. They were trying to dry out their furniture in the sun. I think that image it exemplifies the fact that the night is a space of terror, and kind of led me from the first chapter to conceptually move to the second chapter. So they are like, each chapter follows from one to the other, but also develops the idea more. So you could think of that image as a critical point or a juncture going from one to the other.
What primary message do you aim to convey to the public through your photography exhibition? And what responses or considerations do you wish viewers to engage in after experiencing your work?
I would say, rather than one main thing, it's a big project which I've been working on for 10 years now, and maybe I'll keep working on, because climate change is not going anywhere at this point, right? So I think that's a big problem with climate change and with essentially working with climate change as an artist. So primarily, I think the first thing is to make people aware of what's happening in the Bengal Delta, and secondly, hopefully this project inspires people to take action or change on a multitude of levels, right? Like, the first is individual action, which we talk about all the time. You cut down your carbon costs and all of that, but I really think the more effective way is for people to come together and create pressure on their own governments and create a space for systemic change rather than individual action, right? So I hope this project contributes to that in some way. So contributes more effectively in trying to bring about systemic change. I know it's very difficult, and I hope it is still a small step for people to get inspired to take that action. I also want this project to be like a reference point for people I'm not an activist myself. I am an artist, but I wish that the project is used by other activists, other organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, as evidence or as a testament to what's happening, and pressurize their audiences, their governments to effectuate change. So that is really my hope with the project.